Hey everyone, my name is Nick Lambert. I'm the CEO of Doc Labs and welcome to our latest live event. Today's topic, another different one of course, we are looking at securing America's digital destiny. And we've got a guest who's going to describe a blueprint for transforming identity, protection and defeating fraud. And our esteemed guest is Jordan Burris, the head of public sector at Socure. Many thanks for joining us today. Jordan, how are you?
Doing quite well, Nick. Thank you for having me.
Very good, very good. So Jordan is going to run through a kind of presentation. It's kind of outlining I think it's like a 5-pillar strategy for kind of modernizing identity verification and management, reducing frauds and improving access to government services. And as we were just talking there, Jordan, in the kind of little intro section just before we went live, I think the session is exciting not only for the content that we'll run through, but also just the sheer timing of it. I think with so much going on in politics in the world today, and particularly within the US around government efficiency, I think it's just the timing is great for really kind of focusing in on this specific topic. So really looking forward to hearing you talk through that. The session today will be a kind of similar format for us, unless if you haven't been here before. What we typically do would have a guest who would speak, in Jordan's case, for 20, 25 minutes, 30 minutes, something in that area. And then I'll run through a Q&A with Jordan for questions that we've been working on with him to get a better understanding and dig into some of the key points of the topic a little bit more. And then in the last kind of 10 or 15 minutes, we'll open it up to audience questions. And so the audience, thank you for joining us. If you could, you're watching this in Riverside right now. If you could feel free to ask any questions that either you have now or come up during the course of this event. You can tap them into Riverside, and then Francisco will kind of gather them all together and we'll ask those towards the end. And if you could also just let us know that you're there and where you're listening from, just giving us some sign of life, that's always helpful to know that there's someone listening and watching us. So thanks very much for joining us today as well. And if you have signed up, you will get the edited version of today's event within, it normally takes us, I think, 3, 4, 5 days, something like that, to email it back out to you. But thanks again for joining us. So without further ado, Jordan, I will pass over to you. You have the floor.
Much appreciated, Nick. And so, I thought I would do something a little bit interesting today and really just try to lay out kind of the framing and thought that we had at Socure as we were examining what was happening with what was the transition from the Biden administration to the Trump administration, but then also kind of where we are today within the U.S. specifically related to digital identity and how this has ramifications all across really the global economy. In particular. And I think for us, what it spurred was the need for us to really try to paint a picture of a blueprint, one that would help us drive progress in creating a better digital destiny, if you will, for how we're engaged and involved in this conversation. To start off with, for those who don't know much about my background, so yes, I have the pleasure of leading the public sector business for a company called Socure that specializes in identity verification and fraud prevention overall. Right, the company has worked over 12 years in this space to basically stop bad people from committing fraud while allowing very different parts of the population increase access, if you will, to a whole host of digital services. For me in particular, I've worked over 15 years in the digital trust arena. Actually, prior to coming over to Socure, I served in the White House and was responsible for a number of policies, executive orders, and other items during the first Trump administration and through the first part of the Trump administration and first part of the Biden administration, all pertaining to things such as cybersecurity, digital identity, a lot of what's going on in fraud. So some of this hits very close to home for me. And really, from where I'm speaking, it's also a perspective on why we have to start to make better progress in this space, why we have to kind of break with the status quo and really carve out a new future. When I go to look at digital identity today, and when I talk about the importance of it and how it's the underpinning of everything that we have to deliver across the global economy, the reality is that you can't there's no way that you can name a government service that exists today, whether it be getting access to within the U.S. at least food assistance, emergency disaster relief, access to the DMV, access to what would be processes that then allow you to open up bank accounts or to participate in things like online gaming. You can't have any of these conversations today without having some type of assurance that the person you're engaging with or the entity that you're engaging with on the other end of the computer screen is who they claim to be. Often, far too often, this process it has within the U.S. specifically is one that is fraught with hassle or friction, right? People, it takes minutes, it takes days, weeks, some cases months for them to be able to prove who they are online. And a lot of it is tied and systemic and built around kind of this approach where the only way that you were originally able to validate who you were was to do so in person, right? Embracing what is kind of a digital first mindset is something that unfortunately has not been top of mind for a number of years. And we've put way too much of the burden on the public for being able to engage in these areas. It's interesting, though, that as a number of efforts have been launched historically over the last 3, 4, 5 years in order to advance how we're approaching customer experience or improving the way in which we engage online, we've seen in a number of instances kind of this stance where we will sacrifice security and even the aspect around fraud prevention in order to bolster what is a renewed experience online. So the premise was that, hey, it's too hard to engage online. It's too hard to confirm that it is the right person that you're dealing with. So we're not going to worry about that piece. We're just going to make sure everyone has a great experience. Well, what do you do when that occurs? You open up the floodgates of, unfortunately, fraud and all those who would do wrong and intercept what would be a lot of these, what was intended as far as these digital services for good people. So much so that if you look historically, entities within the U.S., such as the Government Accountability Office, they've highlighted that upwards of $500 billion annually, and that number is very much understated, and we'll talk a little about why, but has been lost to fraud. Right. And for those who work within the public ecosystem or even within the commercial world in particular, we understand kind of the paramount how important it is at this time to really be talking about fraud, waste, and abuse, to understand the reality is that if something is intended to be spent on a purpose, whether that is delivering a benefit to someone across the public or in providing, if you will, for our livelihoods, we need to make sure that every dollar is going to that individual. And so with that in mind and understanding kind of the landscape that we had in front of us, we took it upon ourselves to look at, hey, what could we do? What could be tweaked systemically all across kind of the national landscape within the US in order to promote more of a future where you can have advanced identity protection, but then also counterbalance it with fraud, right? And it's not as easy as to say that one tool can solve them all, even though I have a very strong opinion about how technology can play a role there. But it's also understanding the landscape that we have today, right? And so with that, definitely a few pillars that we highlighted overall in terms of how we want to approach this, 5 in particular. The first pillar is around understanding what it is to have or to potentially look at designating digital identity and everything that supports it as critical infrastructure. Now, for those not familiar with the critical infrastructure comment, these are functions that effectively the government has deemed so necessary or the U.S. government has deemed so necessary to promoting our economic security, our national security, our livelihood, that additional focus and resources are required in order to make them functional and have them operating for the long term. Things that are designated as critical infrastructure today include like the financial ecosystem, water, the electrical grids, et cetera. To the point of there's no way that you can engage digitally online without having identity be core part of it. For me, it has always been kind of this thought that we needed to actually move into a space where we're looking at identity as a key piece of that infrastructure or that critical infrastructure such that we can make sure that it's appropriately resourced, it's prioritized, it's integrated into everything that we're delivering across the country. And then ultimately, we're able to get ahead of some of these endemic challenges that have left the floodgates open to fraud overall. For me, that includes doing such things as updating some of the underlying presidential policy directives that established critical infrastructure across the U.S. to incorporate digital identity. This also means thinking about digital identity holistically instead of leaving it in silos. There are way too many pieces of the puzzle across the entire life cycle of identity today that where you're leaving individuals to kind of fend for themselves, or you're allowing fragmentation to rule the day. By us changing our behavior, by us starting to think more holistically about identity and all the facets or pieces that make up what is that mosaic of someone online, I believe that it puts us in a position to be able to move forward more comprehensively and to be able to start to tackle and invest and prioritize what we need to change related to digital identity. The second pillar that we talked about was basically taking swift action to unify and bring things into more of a cohesive mindset going forward. I had one of the pleasures I had was to work with the first U.S. National Cyber Director, Chris Inglis, and he always talked about teamwork. He always talked about the importance of, especially within the cybersecurity arena, acting as a community in order to basically defend all of us. In particular. And even though identity and fraud in some cases, it's kind of been like this nebulous thing. It's partially cybersecurity. It's partially not, especially if you're thinking about payments and fraud in particular. The reality is that we have to apply a similar mindset where we're starting to unify the perspectives, unify the incentives, bring together kind of this cohesion that is needed to make the hard choices that are ultimately required to put us in a better position. This includes such things as not straying away from the premise of establishing a national strategy for digital identity and trust, right? And really what we're looking at is making sure that there's clear lines of effort, that there is a complete and total understanding of who is responsible for what piece of digital identity and how that all fits together under one broad picture. But also looking at how we're positioned within the US at least to operate globally. And how are we promoting or, if you will, taking steps to confirm anything that we do is interoperable? Because that's the reality of what folks are going to face beyond what they may do within the US. Every time that they go to engage internationally, we need to make sure that that same identity that is established, that same digital identity can then be leveraged and operate within those other ecosystems. That takes pulling everyone together to then drive kind of this premise on how are we collaborating and standardizing across the board. When it comes to doing such things as creating a unified approach to identity policy, I cannot tell you the amount of executive orders I worked on, memos that I've written, or even pieces of legislation that were introduced by members of Congress, but did not necessarily get signed into law, where there have been different takes, approaches, thoughts around how we could approach digital identity. Even today, all across the U.S., the states, every state has their own approach to pursuing privacy, for an example, or their usage of AI. This patchwork, this framework that they've put in place, unfortunately, makes it very difficult in order to do something at a national scale and actually move towards something where identity can be unified. It actually makes it and creates the challenges, the friction that often prevent us from getting this right overall. And so putting more of a focus on there is important. And then, of course, the last piece associated with this pillar was about public awareness and education. It is paramount that we bring everyone along with us. It's important that we make sure we educate everyone as to what we're talking about with digital identity, so it becomes less scary over time, right? You can imagine the first time that Apple rolled out Face ID, everyone was scared as to what was happening with their faces. They were capturing it in order to unlock their phone. It was through education. It was through an ongoing campaign. It was through user adoption. And effectively, many folks today are looking at, how can I just use this for everything that I do in life? I actually very recently went to a baseball game where I was able to enroll and sign up and walk through the gate without pulling out a ticket because they had linked it to a biometric that I had, right? This is a future that you can realize, but you have to do it through public education overall. When we talk about the third pillar, a lot of it comes into transparency and measurement, right? And for me, really with this, what we're trying to talk about, what we're trying to encapsulate here is that as with any of these large macro shifts that are required, the only way that you're going to do it successfully is by being transparent. It cannot be done in a back room. It must be done with the public engaged and fully aware of what's occurring. I often say the best disinfectant is sunlight, to steal a famous quote. And really, for me, that comes down in basically a few areas where we can promote more of this transparency. The first is getting it right with digital identity metrics. The best way to measure performance improvement, the best way to showcase where there are gaps and how we need to evolve is by having clear metrics, clear criteria that we can hold everyone to in the standard, and then push for those upper bounds, push for perfection ultimately. All right. So starting off there, that's something that has been lacking for a long period of time within digital identity, and we can talk more about that. But generally, that provides us a blueprint of how we can go forward. There's also understanding the importance of engaging in regular public reporting and periodic audits such that you can provide the results of what's going on out to the public for scrutiny. And that way they can effectively determine whether or not their investment, their tax dollars, the things that they're doing are serving them or working for what the intended purpose was ultimately. And then the third area is creating really this feedback mechanism for citizens, for the public to be able to engage. Right. There was at one point in time a thought that, public comments, whenever there's a new regulation that's put out, for an example, there's a public comment process, but not many folks know how to engage effectively with that. We have to find ways to bring more people into that dialogue because it's really their experiences, their challenges that are going to define how we move forward, especially as we talk about digital identity. When I look at the fourth pillar, right, and this pillar was about building a strong network around fraud prevention. In particular, I did something such as calling for a digital identity task force within the White House. It doesn't necessarily have to be a digital identity task force. That's one convening mechanism. There's others that can be put together. But the reality is that you need to have a group that is charged and responsible for leading us ahead and helping us to move forward, and a number of the actions that are required to put us on a better foothold. And as we look at fraud prevention as a discipline and instilling that, especially across the U.S., it's important that we start to adopt practices and premises that have been used within the cybersecurity community. It did take them some time to get there, though, but start to apply towards fraud prevention. This includes such things as finding ways to advance threat detection and intelligence sharing. There are rich signals. There's understanding of what fraud patterns look like. Everyone is now solving this problem individually, and they're not aggregating it at scale. One thing that we do at Socure is actually within our entire customer network, we actually pool that shared intelligence that through a consortium, so that way everyone can benefit at scale with understanding what fraud looks like, how it is evolving, what the trajectory is, and then we can take actions to, as a community, work to be more proactive. I think nationally, that is a similar type of mindset and premise that needs to be put in place. On top of that better sharing of intelligence, getting public-private partnerships right, getting that sharing, getting that trade-off between engaging with government and what happens with the commercial world, that's absolutely important. And it's something we have to walk in lockstep together. I've always been of the premise that government has to lead in this space, but it's very important that private sector is working hand in glove with them in order to advance the ball overall in the mission. And then I'm going to take it right back to what we're talking about operating globally, right? We have to enable cross-border cooperation on identity theft and fraud prevention. This means collaborating with allies, finding ways that we can bolster our defenses, that we can make sure that when we're under siege from what are nation state fraud attacks, which are happening second by second at this point, that we are able to take actions as a global community to basically clamp down and stop what is effectively illicit money movement, or things that lead to illicit money movement, things that are leading to human trafficking, things where digital identity, when used in malicious purpose, or it is causing harm to a number of individuals all across the globe. And so with the fifth and final pillar, and then of course would love to continue with questions. Really, what we were seeking and talking about was harnessing American innovation to combat digital threats. And I think this is just innovation overall in general, right? There's a number of different things that are evolving all across the globe that I think we just need to be harnessing overall. But for far too long, there within at least the public sector, there's always been this hesitancy that every time there is a new technology or a new advancement that's rolled out, we engage in a process of analysis paralysis, and we analyze something for many years before it's actually implemented and it's allowed to foster or be used to advance the mission overall. Breaking through that is absolutely paramount to doing this. And one thing that I'll applaud the administration on today, or very recently, is that not only did they release an executive order about American AI innovation in particular, but even within one of the old offices I used to work, the Office of Management and Budget within the White House, they released guidance to agencies basically telling them to harness AI in order to move forward, right? But this goes so much further than just AI, even though that's one piece of it, right? You can think about, as the conversations are going to evolve with quantum, as the conversations are going to evolve with high performance computing, et cetera, we have to be harnessing just different tools in order to do what is paramount here: enable access for people and fight fraud ultimately. Now, in doing all of that and harnessing an innovation mindset and doing more than words on paper, investments are going to be key. But again, this ties back to, if we made it critical infrastructure, then these investments become easy. But investments are going to be key to here. Furthering research and development specifically about what it takes to stay ahead in the digital identity arena and preventing identity fraud. And then how AI plays a role in that, along with other emerging technologies. All of that is going to be critical and paramount here. And then making sure that we're building a workforce that is trained and has all the tools available for them in order to engage within this ecosystem. This means training people from day one, those coming out of university or others, in order how to use AI in order to advance the work that they're doing, how you're able to then pivot that to further various efforts within digital experience or identity in order to really make an impact overall. And so for us, really, when we're talking about kind of this 5-pillared approach, when we're talking about how all these things fit together, a lot of it is about, again, building that cohesion, breaking through the logjam that has been perennially in place that's prevented us from making progress across the U.S., but really building this comprehensive set of actions, this blueprint, if you will, to transform identity across the U.S. and, if anything, catalyze its further usage globally in the fight against fraud. And so with that, happy to engage in further.
Awesome. Yeah, really good. Thank you for going through that. And you can tell you've absolutely internalized your message. You were very kind of smooth in kind of delivering that message. You didn't miss a beat. So thank you very much for kind of running through that, Jordan. It was really, really good. As before we kind of get into questions proper, it kind of occurred to me as you were speaking, you've moved from effectively kind of obviously working for the government into a very fast moving kind of private company. How have you found just very quickly that transition? As it felt like, and maybe that kind of lends itself to that question about innovation mindset, where maybe sometimes governments get saddled with the perspective that they are kind of slower moving and not very innovative, and then you move into the private space and it's the opposite of that, particularly in venture-backed companies like Socure. How have you found that transition? And is there some similarities between the two organizations?
Yeah, so it's actually funny for me because I find there are a lot of similarities. I think my wife would say, to the effect, she sees me more now that I am at Socure than she did when I worked in the government. So the reality is that there is a lot of things that are fast-paced within government. There's a lot of things now that even the private sector is catching up on that was once envisioned within government. However, takes government longer to implement it. And so one thing that I've found refreshing about being on this side is this understanding all of, you can call it bureaucracy, you can call it the hurdles, you can call it the rationale by why things have been done the way that they have been, but understanding that and then being able to apply different techniques and tactics to break through it. Right. I don't think I'm never a fan of hearing the statement, it's always been done this way, and therefore you can't move forward. I think when you're in government, in particular, there's kind of this reality that everyone's very hesitant to be kind of the hard charger to move forward and to, to push for the piece of innovation because of all the things that could go wrong. And rightfully so, they should be. There's an entire complex legal framework. There's policies that have been put in place. There's a lack of resourcing. There's a whole host of reasons to do it. But getting the urgency and kind of that mission-based motivation to charge forward, I think that is what is always powerful about anyone that works in government. And now that I'm back in the private sector, being able to do that with Socure and then align that to effectively what agencies are able to do with their mission has been powerful. And for many organizations that we support today, they've been transformed with that kind of energy and thinking and understanding kind of where they are and how they can continue to.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks for running through that. And you mentioned, I think you've cited a report, I think it's the Government Accountability Office. I think there's an estimation that around $500 billion annually is defrauded from the US government. Where are you seeing, or where is it estimated that where that fraud occurs, Jordan?
Yeah, so it's interesting. And what I'll say about like the Government Accountability Office today and the way that they do a lot of their estimations, this is based on like after the fact analysis and the things that they've actually been able to confirm and then extrapolate decisions from there. None of it it's not based on proactive or predictive, if you will, determination of where fraud is occurring. Also, to be clear, to be fair, not all of it is pertained or related to identity. Some of it is we'll call eligibility based fraud, where someone who is the right person is claiming that they should have access to a benefit where they otherwise did not. For me, in the work that we've been doing, the way we've been looking across the space, we actually believe that fundamentally identity fraud as it exists today is very much underreported. And a lot of it is due to the lack of mechanisms that are in place to appropriately measure and quantify and qualify what is occurring, the lack of instances where this technology has been put in place or technology has been put in place to help catch this. And then really just the overall maturation curve of where public sector organizations are today. And again, every organization comes to this realization at different times. The banking and financial sector, if you will, were the first movers. They were the fast movers, but that's because, of course, their bottom line is impacted ultimately when this occurred. For the public sector, it was all laid bare during the pandemic because they were no longer forced to say, you must come in person in order to engage, right? You had to put things online. And so trust became paramount. Then they realized that at scale, with automation, with AI advancing the way that it has, unfortunately, they were susceptible to advanced nation state fraud. And so, I think that really when we're talking about the number for fraud today, yes, 500 billion gets thrown out. I've heard $1 trillion get called out. I think, honestly, if you're looking at anywhere that money is moving or any type of benefit or service, there's likely identity fraud associated with it in some way, shape, or form. And so it wouldn't surprise me by the end of this if you're able to see things that, start to encroach upon, trillions of dollars over time. And it's just because of, the lack of awareness and attention we've paid to it.
Yeah. I was actually wondering, as you're talking there, how much of that would be related to the pandemic, and even thinking back to about kind of businesses claiming, money from the government as they did across many parts of the world. And I'd imagine there would be some kind of fraudulent activity there because, again, it was happening at such a speed, new systems, new processes happening at scale as well. It was definitely going to be something that fraudsters could target. How do you think about, or how do you suggest that modern identity kind of centric approaches, how can they dramatically reduce the fraud that you've been speaking about today, Jordan? What impact can they have, and how can they go about improving the status quo?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we start to talk about modern identity and how it should be thought about or how it should evolve, first and foremost, we have to get past kind of this legacy thinking or this legacy ideology, at least within the US, about how identity is constructed or how you prove it, right? So to paint an example concretely, right, with things such as know your customer or customer identification program, et cetera, there's actually just a minimum bar or threshold of what's required to prove who someone is, right? There's very basic elements of PII, which, oh, by the way, every single time we see a new data breach within the US, that PII is out there for anyone to get their hands on. There's things such as the NIST standards, National Institute of Standards and Technology, their standards for identity in particular, and they paint a picture of 3 varying degrees or levels associated with it. But a lot of it was written back in 2017 before AI and the way that things have been automated have became mainstream for the consumers. They actually did not plan for a future that effectively technology today could break the model that was put in place today. And I think the first piece with modern identity systems is understanding that what worked yesterday will not work tomorrow. So that's the first piece. The second piece is understanding then that we have to start to get into a space where we are more predictive in what is happening with the ecosystem. We're more predictive with identity versus relying on kind of that static evaluation. Now, why do I say predictive? It's because I view identity to be a continuum. It's a spectrum where you're always having to constantly monitor, evaluate, and evolve. There's different risks associated with how someone is presenting themselves, specifically in digital contexts. So it's not good enough to say that just because someone validated or verified who they were yesterday, that the way that they present themselves tomorrow might have evolved. And this could be because they've changed their device overnight for any type of reason. Perhaps they were recently getting married and their underlying PII that was associated with their identity has also evolved. What if they were in some type of familial dispute, and then as a result, they lost access to everything that they had that basically made up their digital footprint, and they had to go and basically start from scratch. Like, these are all factors that start to play into the equation. And so when you're able to get to more predictive perspective on identity, you're then able to think throughout the life cycle, how it evolves, how you can continue to provide assurance that it is the right person on the other end of the screen.
Yeah, fantastic. And then when you're talking about the 5 pillars during your talk, Jordan, you talked within Pillar 2 about having the notion of a national strategy for digital identity. And I think you also kind of mentioned, the obvious notion that investing in identity would pay for itself. And we've talked about how the kind of fraud levels could be half a trillion, $1 trillion, and many more. But certainly it could, pay for itself. I think that would be a fairly fair assumption. What's holding the government back then? Surely this is something that they should be getting their attention straight away.
It's a great question. If I had a crystal ball, I guess I probably wouldn't. I would be doing many other things in my life. But the reality is my hypothesis, my premise, or the premise that I've operated with for a number of years, is that in a number of instances, it's fear. Fear of the unknown and the uncertainty associated with it. It actually does hold government back from moving faster in this space. Whenever we start to talk about identity, for an example, everything effectively starts to shift towards the worst way in which getting more of a centralized view or taxonomy or approach to identity, basically how that can go wrong. And please don't get me wrong. Yes, those are all things that must be protected, and that can be such things as hyper surveillance that basically is preventing anyone from being able to move, right? Identity being used to lock people out of accessing anything today. But in doing that, we've actually created so many fragmentations that it is easier for malicious actors to operate. It is harder for good people to be able to prove who they are, and they experience enormous amounts of friction when trying to engage in an online ecosystem and service. And so getting over this concept of fear that has perennially challenged anyone who's engaged in digital identity, it's important. To tell you a story, I remember at one point in time, there was a conversation I was having in the government where there was a thought of what would it mean to get rid of the Social Security number as it exists today. Now, the social security number historically was basically put in place to act as a routing number, if you will, for a bank account, right? Your retirement bank account backed by the government. It was not meant to become, if you will, a proxy for establishing someone's identity or looking at it. So the thought was, what would happen if we got rid of it? What happens if we would get rid of it and replace it with, some type of cryptographic mechanism, as folks in Estonia or other countries have done or evaluated today. Even the chatter of that, when it hit the public, being discussed, created such a backlash and swirl, if you will, that everyone said, we're not touching identity and not kind of starting to solve other parts of the problem. I think that's the important piece there, right? Is that we have to find a way to get ahead of it. We have to have more of a conversation.
Yeah. And do you think, I guess, and I'm not advocating for either form of government or localization, but I'm guessing the kind of the way that America's federated, that I'd imagine as well adds a complexity layer that maybe you don't see in other parts of the world, like, the UK, where all the stuff is kind of run for the most part centrally. There's some powers divested out to individuals, but for things like this, that would be centrally run in London. Do you think that has a kind of large factor to play here as well, in terms of being able to turn new technologies and investment around when it's fragmented across the states?
Absolutely. And I think that really plays into like the path towards adoption, right? Because, the saying goes within the US, at least, if you've seen one state, you've seen one state. And there's 50 of them. So the reality is that generally what it takes to do something nationally is getting every single state, or a large majority of them, moving in the same direction. This has happened with any major policy shift that has occurred over time, or even technological adoption. It is, there's things federally that could be done and pushed down, but usually there's lots of challenges associated with that. Generally, what you're looking to see is a groundswell movement where states individually are taking steps and then kind of summing up to, now, okay, we're comfortable with it. Let's do this more at a national scale. And that fragmentation, unfortunately, is what elongates the timeline, or the horizon, if you will, for making some of these changes.
Yeah. And just final point on that, do you think there's a government mindset, maybe this is kind of exploring that topic from before, of kind of government kind of agencies versus private, where it would take someone in the government to basically stick their neck out and say, look, I think we should invest more money here, at a point where every government literally in the world is under pressure to cut costs. And maybe it's easier for someone that running an agency actually just to continue on as it is, because if you put your head on the chopping block and it doesn't pan out, then there'll be trouble for you. So do you think there's that kind of risk taker mindset that maybe you might see in private enterprise doesn't always translate well into kind of government backed projects?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's because it was constructed that way. So this is the fascinating piece for me, as I often engage with folks in different industries who are talking about how the government is moving in particular, right? So the premise would be, a system is dying or it's failing. There would likely be some type of capital investment made by a company in order to repair the system, replace it, do so on and so forth. Well, unfortunately, what often will happen is that the agency leader may say, hey, I have to make this change. I need to make it now. They don't get to make the ultimate choice, though, because there's separation of powers and how the U.S. constructed. They'll have to engage with a member of Congress. If Congress doesn't deem that is a good idea, or they don't think that it'll move at a fast enough pace, or they don't think that they want money to be spent towards it, they'll say no. And they'll say things such as, you have to find it out of your existing budget. They already didn't have the budget, so it wasn't going to happen. You have to have the hard conversation of, okay, something won't get done, but there's a veto that doesn't exist with that entity. It exists with someone else in order to make that. And then let's say that hypothetically everyone agreed, they found the path forward. If there was enough public engagement and interaction to say that was a bad idea and it's not going to work, whatever it is that they decided to move on, then the whole position could be reversed. And so it was built that way, where you can't necessarily have some of that unilateral thinking. I'm intrigued by the premise or things that are being done today, where they're kind of stretching on what that, how far you can go, and kind of, leaning into some of the change, because I think some of the change is needed. It's good. It's good to rethink it. But ultimately, it's always hard for me whenever I hear, having lived on both sides, right? I understand the reasons why something doesn't move quickly, and I also understand why it's important that we find ways to move it faster, because otherwise we end up with what we see today, stagnation, where nothing occurs.
Yeah. And I'm sure that's what makes you a good employee for Socure, and probably why they brought you into the role that you're in now, because you understand that world, probably as good as anyone. So yeah, that makes sense. Unless you kind of lived under a rock, Jordan, obviously you'll be familiar with EIDAS 2 and the kind of European obsession with identity, and the kind of big focus on rolling out, having the 27 EU member states roll out identity wallets for its citizens by the end of next year. And we just tend to absolutely get wrapped up in this, but it's always great to have thoughts from other parts of the world. How do you think a US-based identity solution, do you imagine, like, when you get to that stage, and I know we're seeing mDLs, but other kind of US-based identity solutions, when they would be interoperable with things like EIDAS 2 and the EU Digital Identity Wallet? How do you think, again, using that crystal ball that we would all love to have, how would you see that maybe coming together?
Yeah, so it's interesting, because I do spend a lot of time thinking and talking with folks about it. I think we're going to, so it has to happen, first and foremost, right? It has to happen. It's really a question of the catalyzing event or moment that is going to drive its adoption faster. I think with what we're seeing evolve within, and unfortunately, like, to pick on the US a little bit, we passed, what is it, early 2000s Real ID Act, which talked about standardizing all the ways that our driver's licenses are, how you vet people for them. It's taken 20 plus years to roll out, and we're, I think, in May 7th of this year, we're finally going to get to the point where everyone is forced to be 100% compliant, or they won't be able to travel domestically. I think that similar types of catalyzing moments or events, when put in place, are going to then force the conversation and reality, the implementation that is required to take some of those types of approach, where the interoperability from the US then moves forward. I also think just leadership on this subject in particular is paramount, and it is necessary in order to drive it forward. Generally, what I would imagine how this would play out is that as we continue to engage in kind of the dialogue of how the US engages globally, what that looks like in trade or other areas, there's going to be a moment where effectively interoperability is the only way that we're going to be able to engage, especially as we're talking about travel or digital ecosystem in particular. And then that is going to be the thing that forces us ahead. I personally would like to see something in place within like the next 2 to 3 years. That's a little bit optimistic, in particular, for where we are. But generally, I think with the right type of focus, at the very least, the right framework could be set up for how we would move forward in doing that within the next 2 to 3 years, and then probably implementation.
Yeah. And what's the risks then? Like, I mean, we talk about the EU, and again, it has this somewhat, I mean, it's I guess, somewhat federated as well. You get this kind of separate countries, but they can be kind of compelled to work under the kind of under the EU with some of the regulations. And I'm wondering, and as a consequence of that, they can have these kind of more cohesive strategies around identity, whereas you could make the argument that there isn't one right now in the US. Again, it's federal based. Mm-hmm. What are the downsides of having I mean, there's many upsides to having a kind of federation, but also what are the downsides about not having this maybe more cohesive national strategy that you would see, Jordan?
So, I mean, the downsides of not doing it today is everything I talked about, of like the difficulty that's actually placed on different parts of the population with being able to engage. And effectively, we're kind of reaching this tipping point of people being locked out of the ecosystem, right? And so there's far too many individuals, whether they are those who are immigrating from one country to another, whether they're those who are, we'll call more digital nomads, or those who are not, if you will, in the digital arena as well, that they're finding it more increasingly difficult to start to participate. And access has become an issue. Something that's it's been highlighted for a number of years from different groups like the World Economic Forum or others, is that identity inclusion is becoming more and more difficult for organizations. There's a lot of advancements that are happening, don't get me wrong, but it's kind of like the paralysis and waiting is really what's becoming the challenge. I think that by having the constant federation that we're having today, we're going to find more people left out of that ecosystem by leaning into the federation, by leaning into finding the opportunities to engage. Here, we're going to be able to bring more folks into the fold who otherwise would not have been able to participate. And that's what I look forward to evolving.
Very good. We're almost into audience questions. There's quite a few of them come in. So thanks for everyone for chipping those in. And we look forward to kind of asking those of Jordan very soon. Just one thing I'd like to kind of click into a little bit more is you mentioned at the start of your talk, Jordan, about having the requirement to need a complete picture of who someone wants to be online. We also talked a little bit later on, just when you and I started chatting about kind of, the privacy requirements that you might have, like, obviously for that type of things is very important. I think obviously, across the world, we've seen with all the revelations of Snowden, how, things can get out of hand and how important user privacy can be. How do you kind of square the circle of needing that complete picture of someone who claims to, who they are online, while still giving them the user privacy that I think we would probably mostly advocate for?
Yeah, it's a very interesting place, because in some cases they're opposing views, right, about how often you're verifying and validating someone, and then also looking to maintain privacy. I sometimes joke is that to do identity fraud prevention right, privacy must become an illusion, and that's a joke for anyone who's going to click this later. But the real point to it is that, look, in order to actually try to establish some type of viewpoint into who someone is without forcing some type of in-person enrollment to occur, right, you're going to need to understand the different factors that make up or comprise someone's digital footprint, whether you're looking at the IP address that they're coming from, the device that they're using, the PII that they have associated with them, biometrics to the extent that they play a role, credentials, whether it be mobile driver's licenses or other global identity documents or pieces of evidence as they exist today. Like, all of those are going to be basically, they have to be viewed in order to kind of paint a picture of what they are. I also believe that when the event takes place where you can then establish that it is the right person, that finding a way to bind it to some sort of reusable identity or reusable authenticator ultimately is absolutely paramount. However, and this is where it becomes interesting, is that it cannot be a one-time event that the binding takes place, and it is not constantly evaluated to confirm that the binding remains in place. And so there's it's interesting to try to explain, but it's like this world where we've taken what would be, take your mobile driver's license or take your this credential of some sort. You've done the upfront process to bind an identity to it and all those facets. And now you've gone into this mode of continuous monitoring where you're evaluating the things that reduce trust and the strength of that credential over time. And kind of building that ecosystem is really what is, I think, would be paramount to be able to move into a place where everyone can, they know the event that'll take place, where they will engage consent-based wise in order to achieve their credentials, so that way they can move. The credentials then can be used to preserve privacy to the extent possible as they're engaging across the digital ecosystem. And then there's going to be trigger events or trigger points that then allow you to have to ask the question again, hey, does this credential still relate to this original entity, right? And that way they can engage in that more consent-based process. It gets really complex to think about it if you're thinking about the opposing views. But for me, I think that's honestly the way that we'll have to end up. And it's really globally the way we'll have to end up. But specifically within the US, I think that is the answer of like how we're going to get past where all the privacy arguments we've had.
Yeah, it's a fascinating talk. I mean, I think you could almost have an hour just talking about that, Jordan, as well. Like, I was tempted to ask a question, but I'm actually going to get into audience questions because I never do a good enough job of referring to those early enough. But that's really an interesting point that be good to revisit at some point in the future. But very, very interesting. So moving into the questions now, we've got a question from Pierce. Pierce, thanks for joining us. Pierce's question is, in establishing leadership and digital identity to combat fraud, is personal digital identity the main focus, or perhaps the combination of personal and organizational identity? Is that the important thing for you?
So it's interesting. So a lot of my focus right now in the work that I do is looking at basically the person and how they present themselves. I understand how they present themselves when they're engaging in, I would say, consumer facing or focused interactions. However, I also recognize that all of us have, we can call different personas, different ways in which we engage, whether it is the way that I engage when I'm, buying something online through Amazon, or it's the work that I do at Socure and the way my identity is managed. I think all pieces, and we're seeing a blending where effectively both sides of it, it's requiring the same type of technique and tactic to confirm that it is the right person. So it's been interesting. A lot of the work has started in looking at like financial services and how payments are being rendered, how accounts are being managed within banks. But we also find that with the workforce, and we're talking about within an organizational context, there have been a number of instances where there have been hiring actions and decisions associated with people who are not who they claim to be, and your traditional background screening processes as they were constructed could not catch that it was someone who was fraudulent. They didn't know until perhaps the real identity was found. Someone reported it as deceased. The person who they had interviewed and made the job offer to, someone else showed up later in the organization. And so I see with the blending of basically these worlds, or the need to have identity verification and fraud prevention at both organizationally and personally, that we're really just reaching a point where it's going to be ubiquitous, and you're going to have these considerations on both sides.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's been certainly something. I mean, Doc hire quite a lot of developers. It comprises a good amount of our workforce, and it's certainly speaking with others in the industry. They have found quite a number of fraudulent people taking interviews that clearly are either not the person that they think they're speaking to, that are actually trying to take up the job. So I think this is not a problem that's happening very occasionally or far away. It's absolutely occurring at scale on a daily basis. So it is definitely a significant problem. Diego's question is, and thanks for your question, Pierce. Diego is asking, what things can governments do to achieve strong adoption of mobile IDs? How do public mobile IDs coexist with private-led digital IDs? Which is a tricky question, I guess, because as we've just been saying, the US government particularly is obviously kind of split and federated. But I don't know if you've got any thoughts about Diego's question.
So it's about so increasing adoption just generally. It's about improving the number of use cases where it's required. I mean, that's ultimately it, right? The way in which, and just to draw a parallel to Real ID, despite the fact it's taken 20 plus years to roll out, which is, again, just the standard by which our driver's licenses are put together. I was thinking about pulling mine up, but I was like, wait, I shouldn't do that online with how technology works today. But the idea being is this, very simply, if we were to basically require, if the US government was to require, or the state governments were to require that mDLs or mobile IDs be used for different pieces or different parts of the economy, or for engaging with regular life, they could force adoption more quickly. The caveat, the trade-off to that, is that there are people who today will not be able to get one, and so there is this balance, this balance that is required, right? Do you require mobile IDs, for an example, if you're engaging in online gambling? Well, if that's the case, are you going to allow people or leave people out of it? Do you require mobile IDs when you're traveling, when you're engaging, or you're requesting a government benefit or service? Like, these are all questions that have been posed. And the reality is that when they go to make the shift to require it and mandate it and adopt it, they have to understand the ramifications of that decision and how that plays out year after.
I often think as well, Jordan, just kind of thinking about that a little bit, where I often think like the combination of not just, like you talked about, increasing the use cases or the number of situations within which a citizen can use a government-backed identity, but also think the ability to blend with private would make that quite powerful as well. So maybe you're able to pick up some attributes from a government-backed ID of any form and blend that in with one's issued privately. And then a citizen can then present that credential somewhere else, and you can really start to exponentially grow the different use cases. So I think that's an interesting one as well. Hopefully governments, and they're doing the opposite in the UK right now, where they're proposing government wallets where only government-backed credentials can exist. But hopefully that will expand, because I think that's really where you start to get use cases that really just expand at pace. So I think hopefully maybe they'll take the same view in the US as well, given your kind of strength in the tech sector.
Yeah, and I will tell you that the view of a combinatorial wallet, I think is fascinating, and I actually think it would be absolutely amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Agni's asking, do you think mDLs, mobile driver's licenses, are a good step forward in the direction of a stronger national digital ID strategy?
I'm always careful when I talk about mDLs and national ID, because it usually goes into some type of reaction. But here's what I'll say. I say it is absolutely a step forward. I think the way in which it can be leveraged and really shift the dichotomy and how they've been used historically, or driver's license has been used historically, right? I think it's absolutely paramount, and it's something we need to embrace and harness. I don't think that they are going to be the end state. I don't think they're going to be the final answer. I think they are going to be a building block towards the final answer. And a lot of it has to do with much of what we've been talking about, the fragmentation that exists, the lack of adoption in all contexts, the reality that there's so much more than what they have that has to be considered, or different considerations for evaluation. But I think that they are going to become the bedrock or foundation of how we start to think about kind of the reuse case with IDs moving forward. And so I am excited to see their continued maturation.
Yeah, and I guess people used to using the tools and tool sets that they would use with more decentralized forms of digital identity. So I think that's a good one. Interest then from Francis, who's asking, you mentioned at the start about I think it was the baseball game that you went to. And I have heard about this before, actually, where you talked about kind of using just the biometric, I guess, kind of facial recognition to enter the game. And Francis is interested to know what system was that and how did it work and where were they getting your biometric from? I have some thoughts about that, but love to hear yours.
Yeah, and so actually, I don't know everything that they were using behind the hood of it, right? And we can also talk about the efficacy, because I did see some misfires along the way. I was just glad I was able to walk in without pulling something out of my pocket at the time, right? But generally, and it's not too far off. Even within some use cases within flights today, there's a premise of we'll call it curb to gate within the U.S., where getting basically from the curb to the gate without having to pull out your ticket, being able to match. There's an enrollment process that takes place. In this instance with the baseball stadium, there was an enrollment that took place where effectively I had to take a selfie, and they compared it to the ticket, if you will, so they could match the entity to the ticket that was associated with it. It didn't actually check my ID, my identity document, etc. But that just starts to serve as like a piece or a foundation, if you will, of how this could be adjusted going forward.
Yeah. Okay. And is that kind of matching? Is that like, I know that there's different regulations in different parts of the world, and I mean, I think in Europe they don't like one-to-many matching. It sounds like, is that a one-to-one match then? I guess you're doing that enrollment process prior to I think maybe when you bought your ticket, and then when you show up, you're actually it's comparing your, I don't know if it's a biometric template or something at that point, Jordan. Is that how that works?
Yeah, sorry about that. See, every now and again, the internet decides it's telling me I need to stop talking. No, so what happened was there was an enrollment process. When I bought the ticket, or when I had the ticket purchased, effectively, they allowed me to match my face to the ticket. And so when I showed up on site to go through the turnstile, it would just pull that comparison for me in the audience. There was, again, efficacy issues associated with some of that. Some people couldn't make it through. And you see that happen quite often. But it starts to give you thinking about how this could evolve over time and what world or ecosystem we could walk into.
Understood. Jordan, that is a great place, I think, to leave the discussion. I certainly feel like I could talk for another hour, but I think we're kind of hitting up to the hard stop. So really appreciate you coming on and taking the time. The insights have been fantastic. And I loved exploring this topic with you. So just quick recap, Jordan Burris, who is the head of public procurement at Socure, or public sector, I should say, at Socure. And we were talking about securing America's digital identity, a blueprint for transforming identity protection and defeating fraud. Jordan, thank you so much for coming on. Thanks also to the audience for taking part and submitting questions. If you have signed up, you will get the session recording back edited in a few days' time. But we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Jordan.
All right. Thanks, Nick. Thanks for having me.